I never thought my signature would be worth anything until it cost Patricia Whitmore her freedom. The day I discovered the forgery was like any other Tuesday in Oakridge Estates, our pristine neighborhood in Burlington, Vermont. The maple trees lining our streets were just starting to turn amber, a perfect postcard image of New England autumn. It was the kind of neighborhood where people moved to raise families and retire, where property values only went up, and where our homeowners association ruled with an iron fist disguised in a velvet glove. I'm Frank Quincy, 42, software developer, and until 3 years ago, just another resident trying to mind my own business in a community where privacy was considered slightly less important than having your lawn mowed to exactly 2.5 inches. I'd bought my colonial-style home after my divorce, looking for somewhere peaceful to rebuild my life. What I got instead was a front-row seat to one of the most bizarre cases of fraud our county had ever seen. The envelope that started it all was sitting on my kitchen counter that morning, the HOA's gold-embossed logo gleaming under my recessed lighting. Inside was a notice informing me that I had agreed to a special assessment of $15,000 for the Oakridge Estates Community Enhancement Project. According to the document, I had not only voted for this project at a meeting I had never attended, but had also signed a binding agreement authorizing them to place a lien on my property if I failed to pay within 30 days. My coffee went cold as I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It looked like mine, similar enough that at first glance I almost believed I'd signed it, but the more I studied it, the more wrong it felt. The way the F curved, the slight hesitation in the Q of my last name. Someone had tried very hard to replicate my handwriting, but they'd missed subtle details that only I would notice. "This is insane," I muttered to myself, reaching for my phone to call my neighbor, Edward Mitchell. Ed had lived in Oakridge Estates for 15 years and was the only board member who seemed to have a soul. He answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. "Frank, it's not even 7 yet. Did you know about this assessment? $15,000 for a community enhancement project." There was a long pause before Ed spoke again. "What are you talking about? The board voted down any new assessments last month. Budget's tight enough with the pool repairs." My stomach dropped. "I'm looking at official HOA letterhead telling me I signed off on this assessment at last week's meeting." "You weren't at last week's meeting. I would have seen you." "Exactly." Ed was silent for a moment. "Come over. Bring the letter." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Ed's kitchen, watching his face grow increasingly concerned as he examined the document. "This isn't right," he said finally, setting it down on the table between us. "This signature, it's not even a good forgery. And I've never seen this project proposal before, which is impossible since I'm the treasurer. So what's going on?" Ed leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. "I don't know, but Patricia's been acting strange lately. Pushing through expenses without proper documentation, scheduling emergency board meetings with little notice. Last month, she tried to award a landscaping contract to her brother-in-law's company without getting competitive bids. Patricia Whitmore had been HOA president for 5 years. A former real estate agent with bleached blonde hair always styled in a perfect bob. She'd run unopposed for most of that time. No one wanted the job badly enough to challenge her, and she'd been efficient enough that most residents were content to let her handle things. She lived in the largest house in the development, a sprawling Tudor that she'd decorated in a style my ex-wife would have called aggressively tasteful. "You think she forged my signature?" I asked, the words sounding absurd even as they left my mouth. Ed shrugged. "I don't know what to think, but something's not adding up. How many other residents got this notice? That's a good question. We spent the next hour calling neighbors. By 8:30, we had confirmation that at least 12 other homeowners had received identical letters, all claiming they had attended a meeting and agreed to the assessment, all with suspiciously similar signatures on the documents. "This is fraud," I said flatly. "We need to call the police." Ed shook his head. "Not yet. We need to confront Patricia first, give her a chance to explain. Maybe there's a misunderstanding." I disagreed, but Ed had been dealing with Patricia longer than I had. We agreed to meet at her house that evening after she returned from her weekly tennis lesson. I spent the day distracted, barely able to focus on the code I was supposed to be debugging for work. By 5 o'clock, I had 3 missed deadlines and a growing sense of unease. I kept thinking about the forged signature, wondering what else Patricia might have signed in my name. The thought made my skin crawl. At 6:30, I met Ed in front of Patricia's house. The sun was setting behind her immaculately landscaped yard, casting long shadows across her perfect lawn. Ed rang the doorbell, and we waited. When Patricia answered, she was wearing white capri pants and a pastel pink polo shirt, her hair freshly styled despite her supposed tennis lesson. Her smile faltered slightly when she saw us both standing there. "Edward, Frank, what a surprise." Her voice was honey-sweet, but her eyes were calculating. "What can I do for you gentlemen this evening?" Ed held up the assessment notice. "We need to talk about this, Patricia." Her expression didn't change, but I noticed her fingers tightening on the door frame. "Of course, come in." I was just about to pour myself a glass of wine. "Would either of you care for one?" We followed her into a living room that looked like it had been staged for a real estate showing rather than actually lived in. Everything was cream and beige with carefully placed pops of color. Not a single item was out of place. Patricia poured 3 glasses of white wine without waiting for our answer and handed them to us with a practiced hostess smile. "Now, what seems to be the issue with the assessment?" "The issue," I said, "is that I never signed this document. Someone forged my signature." Patricia's laugh was light, dismissive. "Don't be ridiculous, Frank. You were at the meeting last Thursday. You voted yes on the proposal and signed the agreement form." "I was in Boston last Thursday on a business trip. I have hotel receipts, conference badges, and about 20 witnesses who can confirm I wasn't anywhere near Oakridge Estates." Her smile dimmed slightly. "Well, perhaps you're mistaken about the date." Ed cleared his throat. "Patricia, I was at every board meeting this month, and we never discussed or approved any community enhancement project. As treasurer, I would have had to sign off on the budget allocation." For a moment, Patricia's mask slipped. I saw calculation in her eyes, then something like resignation before the pleasant facade snapped back into place. "There seems to be some confusion," she said smoothly. "Let me check my records. I'm sure this is all a simple misunderstanding." She disappeared into what I assumed was her home office, leaving Ed and me sitting awkwardly in her living room. I set my untouched wine on a coaster and leaned toward Ed. "She's lying," I whispered. "Obviously," Ed muttered back. "But why? What's she trying to pull with this fake assessment?" We didn't have time to speculate further because we heard a door slam, and then the sound of a car starting in what must have been her attached garage. Ed and I looked at each other in disbelief, before rushing to the front window just in time to see Patricia's white Mercedes backing out of the driveway at an alarming speed. "She's running," I said incredulously. Ed was already on his phone calling 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. I walked into the hall where Patricia had disappeared and found the door to her office ajar. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was a disaster, drawers pulled open, papers scattered everywhere, a shredder overflowing with confetti. On her desk was a stack of letterhead with the HOA logo and what appeared to be practice sheets, dozens of attempts at various residents' signatures, including mine. But it was the open laptop that caught my attention. On the screen was a bank statement showing a series of large transfers to an account labeled PW Consulting. The most recent transfer, dated just 2 days ago, was for $212,000. "Ed," I called, "you need to see this." The police arrived 20 minutes later. Officer Jenkins was a stocky man with a receding hairline and the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much petness in suburban disputes. "So you're telling me your HOA president forged signatures to approve fake assessments, and now she's fled the scene?" he asked, his tone making it clear how ridiculous he found the situation. "Yes," I said firmly. "And based on what we found in her office, she's been embezzling from the HOA accounts for quite some time." Officer Jenkins sighed and pulled out his notepad. "Let's start from the beginning, Mr. Quincy. When did you first notice something was wrong?" By the time we finished giving our statements and showing the evidence we'd found, 2 more patrol cars had arrived, along with a detective named Martinez who took one look at Patricia's office and called for a forensic team. "This is more than just HOA fraud," Detective Martinez explained, her dark eyes serious as she surveyed the chaos of the room. "Based on what we're seeing here, Miss Whitmore has been running a sophisticated scheme for quite some time. We'll need to seize her computer and financial records." It was nearly midnight by the time the police allowed Ed and me to leave. As I drove home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I couldn't shake the image of those practice signature sheets, the careful attempts to copy my handwriting. How long had Patricia been planning this? How many other documents had she signed in my name? The next morning, a fleet of police cars and an unmarked van were parked outside the Oakridge Estates community center. Curious neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering behind their hands as officers carried out boxes of documents and computer equipment. I spotted Detective Martinez directing the operation and approached her. "Any sign of Patricia?" She shook her head. "Not yet, but we've put out an alert." "She won't get far." She gestured to the building behind her. "Your HOA has bigger problems right now. We've found evidence that Miss Whitmore has been systematically draining your reserve funds for at least 3 years. The special assessment was probably her way of covering the shortfall before the annual audit." I felt sick. Our HOA dues were substantial, over $500 a month from each of the 120 homes in the development. The reserve fund should have contained hundreds of thousands of dollars earmarked for major repairs and improvements. How much did she take? "We're still calculating, but preliminary estimates suggest close to $1 million. The number was staggering. I thought about all the times Patricia had talked down residents' concerns at meetings, assuring everyone that our finances were in excellent shape, that we were one of the best-run HOAs in the state. All while she was systematically robbing us blind. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By afternoon, a hastily organized emergency meeting was taking place in the community center's main hall. Nearly every resident was present, the room buzzing with anger and fear. Ed, as the only remaining board member not implicated in the fraud, the other 3 had resigned that morning when the extent of Patricia's crimes became clear, stood at the front trying to restore order. "Please, everyone, I understand you're upset. We all are. But shouting won't solve anything." His voice was nearly drowned out by the crowd's agitation. "How did no one notice the money was missing?" demanded Karen Reynolds, a retired accountant from Maple Drive. "Weren't there audits, oversight?" Ed looked exhausted. Patricia controlled all the financial statements that were presented to the board. She apparently created fake versions showing healthy accounts. The annual audits were conducted by her friend's firm, which we now know was complicit in the fraud. What about our assessments? Called out George Washington, an elderly man from the back of the room. I can't afford to pay $15,000. Those assessments are null and void, Ed assured him. They were never legally approved by the board and the signatures were forged. No one needs to pay them. What about the reserve funds? Asked Eleanor Kensington, a young mother who had moved in just 6 months ago. Is our money just gone? The room fell silent, waiting for Ed's answer. He looked around helplessly before responding. The police and forensic accountants are trying to trace where the money went, but yes, most of it appears to be gone. We had insurance, but it will only cover a fraction of the loss. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Some residents were calling for a class action lawsuit against the former board members. Others wanted to disband the HOA entirely. A few were already talking about selling their homes and moving away from Oakridge Estates, fearing that property values would plummet once news of the scandal became public. I sat there feeling numb, wondering how something as mundane as a homeowners association could have gone so terribly wrong. Patricia had seemed so competent, so dedicated to maintaining our community's standards. All along, she'd been orchestrating an elaborate fraud, using our trust against us. 3 days later, Patricia Whitmore was arrested at a hotel in Montreal. She had dyed her hair brown and was traveling under an alias, but a hotel clerk recognized her from the news and called the authorities. The extradition process began immediately. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Patricia's crimes came to light. She had been systematically embezzling from the HOA for nearly 4 years, creating ghost vendors and fake maintenance projects to justify transfers to accounts she controlled. The special assessment had been her desperate attempt to replace some of the missing funds before the annual financial review, which couldn't be delayed or manipulated this time because of new state regulations requiring independent audits. But the forgery of my signature and those of other residents elevated her crimes from simple embezzlement to something much more serious. Each forged document represented a separate count of fraud and forgery. 6 months after that initial discovery, I sat in a courtroom watching Patricia Whitmore, now dressed in a plain navy suit instead of her usual designer clothes, as she pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. Her attorney had negotiated a plea deal: 5 years in federal prison, restitution of the stolen funds, though only about $300,000 had been recovered, and a lifetime ban from serving on any board or in any fiduciary capacity. When the judge asked if she wanted to make a statement before sentencing, Patricia stood, her shoulders straight despite the circumstances. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the confident, controlling woman who had ruled our HOA with such authority. "I'm sorry for betraying the trust of my community," she said, her voice steady. "I never intended for things to go this far." It was a carefully crafted non-apology that explained nothing and expressed no real remorse, typical Patricia, even to the end. As I watched her being led away in handcuffs, I felt no satisfaction, only a profound weariness. The damage she had done to our community went beyond the missing money. Trust had been shattered. Neighbors who had once socialized freely now regarded each other with suspicion, wondering who else might have been complicit, or at least turned a blind eye to Patricia's activities. The recovery process was slow and painful. A new board was elected, with strict oversight protocols and transparent financial reporting. Ed, despite his exhaustion, agreed to serve as interim president until things stabilized. I found myself drafted onto the board as well, despite my protests that I knew nothing about managing an HOA. "That's exactly why we need you," Ed had argued. "Someone who'll question everything and not just go along with the status quo." Our first challenge was addressing the depleted reserve funds. After endless debates and consulting with financial advisors, we settled on a combination of increased dues by a modest $75 per month, a one-time special assessment, properly voted on and approved this time, of $2,500 per household, and a 5-year plan to gradually rebuild our reserves. It wasn't popular, but it was necessary. Some residents still blamed the former board for not catching Patricia's fraud sooner. Others directed their anger at the new board for having to clean up the mess. A few families ended up selling their homes, unable or unwilling to shoulder the financial burden of recovery. Through it all, I kept returning to the image of my forged signature, the careful strokes that had mimicked my handwriting just enough to pass a casual inspection. It was such a personal violation, someone studying how I formed my letters, practicing until they could recreate my name as if they were me. Sometimes, I still found myself hesitating before signing documents, an instinctive mistrust that lingered long after Patricia was behind bars. 1 year after Patricia's sentencing, I was reviewing bank statements for the HOA. Part of our new protocol required at least 3 board members to independently verify all financial documents when I noticed something odd. A recurring payment to a vendor I didn't recognize, Sunbelt Property Maintenance, $2,300 monthly for landscape buffer zone management. Our development backed up to a protected wetland area, but the buffer zone maintenance was handled by our regular landscaping company. I checked previous statements and found the payments had started 4 months ago, right after we transitioned to a new property management company to help with the administrative burden of running the HOA. "Ed," I said, stopping by his house that evening, "have you seen these payments to Sunbelt Property Maintenance?" Ed frowned at the statements I showed him. "Never heard of them. Let me check the approved vendor list." A quick search confirmed what I'd suspected. Sunbelt wasn't on our approved vendor list. Further investigation revealed the company had been incorporated just 5 months earlier. Its registered address was a UPS store in a nearby town. "This feels familiar," Ed said grimly. "Too familiar." We brought our findings to the next board meeting, where our new property manager, Elaine Keller, a polished woman in her 50s with impeccable credentials, explained that Sunbelt had been contracted to manage the buffer zone after environmental concerns were raised about our regular landscapers' practices. "It was an emergency situation," she insisted. "The contract was approved by email vote." "I never received any email about this," I said. Other board members echoed my statement. Lane looked flustered. "I can show you the emails. All 5 board members approved it." When she produced the emails the next day, they looked legitimate at first glance. All 5 board members had apparently responded with approval. But when I examined my supposed response more carefully, I noticed discrepancies. The timestamp showed I had responded at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, when I would have been asleep. The writing style wasn't mine, too formal, with none of my usual brief, direct communication style. A chill ran down my spine as I realized we might be facing another fraud situation, barely a year after Patricia's conviction. This time, however, we knew what to look for. We hired a forensic IT specialist who quickly determined the approving emails had been fabricated. Further investigation revealed that Elaine Keller had personal connections to Sunbelt Property Maintenance. The company was owned by her son-in-law. When confronted with the evidence, Elaine resigned immediately. We reported the fraud to the police, who discovered that she had been pulling similar schemes in 3 other communities she managed. The amount she had stolen from us was relatively small compared to Patricia's embezzlement, but it was a devastating blow to a community still trying to heal from the previous betrayal. "I can't believe this happened again," I said to Ed as we sat in his backyard after another emergency board meeting. "Are we just magnets for corruption?" Ed sighed, looking older than his 57 years. "HOAs handle a lot of money with relatively little oversight. It's a perfect environment for this kind of fraud." Patricia's case should have been a wake-up call for property management companies and HOAs nationwide, but old habits die hard. The Elaine Keller incident, while disturbing, at least didn't escalate to the level of Patricia's crimes. She hadn't forged signatures on legal documents or stolen nearly as much money. She was charged with fraud and eventually sentenced to probation and community service, along with full restitution of the stolen funds. But the damage to our community's morale was significant. Residents who had just started to trust the new board and management were once again questioning every decision, demanding documentation for every expense, no matter how small. 2 years after Patricia's conviction, I was still serving on the board, despite my periodic attempts to resign. Each time, Ed or other residents would convince me to stay, arguing that my skepticism and attention to detail were valuable assets in preventing future fraud. I had become, somewhat reluctantly, the unofficial watchdog of Oakridge Estates. It was in this capacity that I found myself sitting in a deposition room at the offices of Harrington, Mitchell, and Price, attorneys representing our HOA in a civil suit against Patricia Whitmore. Though she was serving her prison sentence, we were still trying to recover more of the stolen funds, which our investigations suggested she had hidden in offshore accounts or invested in properties under different names. Patricia was brought in wearing a beige prison uniform, her once perfect hair now grown out to show gray roots. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by her circumstances, but her eyes still held that calculating intelligence I remembered. Our attorney, Marcus Harrington, a stern man with wire-rimmed glasses, began questioning her about various financial transactions. Patricia answered minimally, often claiming she couldn't recall specific details. It was a frustrating process with little new information emerging. During a break, I found myself alone with Patricia while the attorneys stepped out to confer. The guard stood by the door, paying little attention to us. For a long moment, we sat in uncomfortable silence. "Why did you forge my signature?" I finally asked, the question that had bothered me for 2 years. Out of all the residents, why target me specifically? Patricia studied me with those cool blue eyes. "You were never at meetings. You paid your dues on time and never complained. You were practically invisible, the perfect target." She gave a small shrug. Nothing personal, but it had felt intensely personal to me. My signature, my identity, used without my knowledge or consent. "You ruined people's lives," I said quietly. "People lost their homes because of what you did, neighbors who trusted you." For the first time, something like regret flickered across her face. "I never meant for it to go that far. It started small, just borrowing from the reserves for a personal emergency. I always intended to pay it back." She looked away. "Then it got easier each time. The board trusted me completely." "No one ever checked." "That doesn't excuse what you did." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, but you asked why, and that's the truth. It was easy, and then it was necessary, and then it was too late to stop." The attorneys returned before I could respond, but her words stayed with me. The casual way she had dismissed her actions as merely taking advantage of an opportunity rather than a deliberate betrayal of trust, was chilling. The civil case dragged on for months, eventually resulting in a judgment against Patricia for the full amount stolen plus punitive damages. Whether we would ever see that money remained doubtful, but the symbolic victory helped some residents feel a measure of justice had been served. 3 years after Patricia's conviction, Oakridge Estates had finally turned a corner. Our reserve funds were almost fully replenished, thanks to careful budgeting and the gradual recovery of some of the stolen money. Property values, which had dipped following the scandal, were climbing again. The new board, which still included me despite my best efforts to retire, had implemented rigorous financial controls and transparency measures that had become a model for other HOAs in the state. I was watering my front garden one evening when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A woman stepped out tall with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun. She approached with confident strides, hand extended. "Mr. Quincy, I'm Detective Martinez. We met during the Whitmore investigation." I shook her hand, surprised. "Of course. What can I do for you?" She glanced around the quiet street before answering. "I wanted to let you know personally that Patricia Whitmore is being released early next week. Good behavior and prison overcrowding." The news hit me like a physical blow. She's only served 3 years of a 5-year sentence. Martinez nodded grimly. "Unfortunately, that's how the system often works. I thought you should know before you possibly ran into her at the grocery store. She's coming back here, to Burlington." The thought of encountering Patricia while going about my daily business was deeply unsettling. Her release conditions forbid her from living in Oakridge Estates or serving on any HOA board. But yes, she'll be staying in the area with her sister while on probation. Martinez handed me her card. "If she contacts you or comes onto your property, call me immediately." Her probation terms are strict no contact with former HOA members or board officials. After she left, I sat on my front steps, processing the information. Patricia would be free, walking the same streets, shopping at the same stores. The woman who had violated my trust, forged my signature, and nearly destroyed our community would be out in the world again while we were still dealing with the aftermath of her crimes. I called an emergency board meeting the next evening to share the news. The reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage. 3 years for stealing nearly $1 million and committing multiple felonies. Margaret Foster from Sycamore Lane was incensed. If she'd robbed a bank for that amount, she'd have gotten 20 years. "White-collar crime is always treated differently," Ed said wearily. "But there's nothing we can do about it except make sure our safeguards remain in place." We drafted a community-wide email informing residents of Patricia's impending release and reminding everyone that she was prohibited from entering the neighborhood or contacting former neighbors. The message aimed to be factual rather than alarmist, but within hours, social media groups for our community were buzzing with anxiety and anger. The day Patricia was released came and went without incident. Life in Oakridge Estates continued its normal rhythm, though I noticed residents seemed more watchful, more likely to question unfamiliar cars driving slowly through the neighborhood. 2 weeks after her release, I was working late at my home office when my doorbell rang. It was nearly 9 p.m., too late for casual visitors. Through the peephole, I saw a figure standing on my porch, face obscured by the angle and poor lighting. Cautiously, I opened the door to find Patricia Whitmore standing there. She looked different from when I'd last seen her at the deposition, healthier, her hair styled in a new short cut and dyed back to blonde, wearing a simple gray pantsuit instead of prison clothes. But her eyes were the same, calculating and intense. "You shouldn't be here," I said, already reaching for my phone in my pocket. "Your probation, I know," she interrupted. "I'm risking a lot coming here, but I needed to talk to you. 5 minutes, that's all I ask." Every instinct told me to shut the door and call Detective Martinez immediately. This woman had forged my signature, stolen from our community, and shown little genuine remorse for her actions. And yet, curiosity kept me standing there. What could be so important that she would risk violating her probation? 5 minutes, I agreed, stepping onto the porch rather than inviting her inside. The clock's ticking. Patricia took a deep breath. "I came to apologize, properly this time, not the statement my lawyer wrote for me to read in court." She met my eyes directly. "I'm sorry, Frank. For what I did to you, specifically forging your signature, violating your trust, and for what I did to the community as a whole." I studied her, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but she seemed genuinely contrite. "Prison gives you a lot of time to think," she continued. "I've had 3 years to reflect on the damage I caused. The people who lost homes because our reserves were depleted when major repairs were needed. The stress I put everyone through. The community I helped build and then nearly destroyed." She shook her head. "There's no excuse for what I did. I can't undo it, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I took from you all, and I am truly sorry." I stood silent for a moment, processing her words. Part of me wanted to believe her, to accept that prison had genuinely changed her perspective. Another part remained deeply skeptical. "Why me?" I asked finally. "Why come to me specifically with this apology?" "Because you were the one who caught me," she said simply. "If you hadn't noticed the forged signature, I might have gotten away with it for months longer, maybe indefinitely. You stopped me from causing even more damage." She paused. "And because I forged your name more than anyone else's. You weren't at meetings, you didn't ask questions, you trusted the system to work. I exploited that trust repeatedly." The admission sent a chill through me. "How many times did you forge my signature?" "Dozens," she admitted. "Whenever I needed a resident's approval for something questionable. You were my go-to-patsy for almost 2 years." The casual way she said it, despite her supposed remorse, reignited my anger. "And you expect me to forgive you, just like that?" "No," she said, surprising me. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just thought you should hear a genuine apology, not something crafted by attorneys or performed for a judge." She glanced at her watch. "My 5 minutes are up. I won't bother you again." As she turned to leave, I found myself saying, "The community is recovering, in case you were wondering. We've rebuilt most of the reserve funds. Property values are back up." Patricia paused, not turning around. "I'm glad," she said quietly. "That's good to hear." After she left, I debated whether to report her probation violation. In the end, I called Detective Martinez and told her about the visit. It wasn't out of vindictiveness, but a sense of obligation to the community and to the legal process. Patricia had made her choice in coming to see me, knowing the potential consequences. 2 days later, Patricia was called before her probation officer. Rather than sending her back to prison, the judge issued a stern warning and tightened her restrictions, requiring her to wear an ankle monitor that would alert authorities if she came within a mile of Oakridge Estates. Life gradually returned to normal, or a new normal, at least. Our HOA continued to operate with enhanced transparency and oversight. The scandal faded from local headlines, replaced by newer controversies and concerns. Residents who had moved in after Patricia's conviction heard about it only as neighborhood lore, a cautionary tale of trust betrayed. 5 years after I first discovered that forged signature, I finally stepped down from the HOA board, having served longer than I ever intended or wanted to. Ed retired as well, both of us ready to return to being regular residents rather than guardians of the community's financial integrity. At my farewell gathering, held in the community center that had been the site of so many contentious meetings during the crisis, Ed raised a toast. "To Frank Quincy," he said, his voice carrying across the room where most of our neighbors had gathered, who noticed what the rest of us missed and had the courage to speak up. "Oakridge Estates owes you a debt of gratitude." I felt uncomfortable with the praise, but I appreciated the sentiment. "I just did what anyone would have done," I responded, "and we all worked together to rebuild." After the party, as I walked home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I reflected on the strange journey that had begun with that forged signature. Patricia Whitmore had completed her prison sentence and, according to what I'd heard, had moved to Florida to start over. The last of the civil settlements had been paid. The reserve fund was fully replenished, and new board members with fresh perspectives were steering the HOA forward. The whole saga had changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was more cautious now, more likely to question authority and verify information independently. I carefully read every document before signing it, a habit born of betrayal that had become second nature. But I had also discovered a capacity for community leadership I hadn't known I possessed, and formed deeper connections with neighbors who had once been mere acquaintances. As I reached my driveway, I noticed an envelope tucked into my front door. Inside was a newspaper clipping about new state legislation requiring stricter financial controls and transparency for homeowners associations throughout Vermont. Paper-clipped to it was a brief note in unfamiliar handwriting. "The Patricia Whitmore Act, some good finally came from all this. Thank you for your part in making HOAs safer for everyone." It was unsigned, but I knew who it was from. I stood there for a long moment, the paper light in my hands but heavy with significance. Then I tucked it into my pocket and went inside, closing the door on the past and looking toward a future where my signature was mine alone, a small thing, perhaps, but mine nonetheless. As I settled into my new role as just another resident of Oakridge Estates, I realized that the true measure of our community wasn't in how we had been betrayed, but in how we had rebuilt stronger, more vigilant, and ultimately more connected than before. Patricia Whitmore's crime had been trying to steal more than money. She had nearly stolen our sense of community and trust. In the end, she had failed. That, more than her prison sentence or the recovery of funds, felt like the real justice.